Music history is full of legends who've been lost to time. Today, we're reviving 20 influential groups from the 1940s that shaped the era but are rarely talked about. Get ready to rediscover the sounds that defined a generation. 20. Glenn Miller Orchestra. Ever wonder what the 1940s sounded like? The Glenn Miller Orchestra captured that essence with a style that changed music forever. The Glenn Miller Orchestra, a powerhouse in the music industry of the 1940s, was formed in 1938 under the leadership of the legendary Glenn Miller himself. Renowned for its distinctive sound characterized by a clarinet-led reed section and complex brass arrangements, the orchestra quickly rose to prominence as one of the most successful 40s bands of all time. With hits like In the Mood and Moonlight Serenade, the Glenn Miller Orchestra left a mark on the swing and big band genres, earning them widespread acclaim. The ensemble's innovative use of clarinet and saxophone sections, combined with Miller's meticulous arrangements, contributed to their captivating sound. The Glenn Miller Orchestra's influence on the music industry of the 1940s was unparalleled, as they dominated the charts and shaped the decade's cultural landscape. Their legacy continues to resonate through time, and their impact on the evolution of 40s bands and swing music remains a testament to their musical prowess and spirit. '19. The Andrews Sisters. Three sisters went from imitators to trailblazers. But what made the Andrews Sisters the most iconic female group of their time? The Andrews Sisters started out as a tribute band to the sisters mentioned above, the Boswells, but quickly found their own style and their own hits, turning them into America's most popular female singing group. The group consisted of three sisters, contralto Laverne Sophia, soprano Maxine Angelin, Maxine, and mezzo-soprano Patricia Marie, Patty. After 6 years on the road with various dance bands and touring in vaudeville, they had their first hit with Bei mir bist du schön. They followed this success with a string of best-selling records over the next 2 years and became a household name by the 1940s. The sisters sold well over 75 million records, the last official count released by MCA Records in the mid-1970s, starred in 17 Hollywood movies, and were established radio personalities. Their 1941 hit Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy can be considered an early example of rhythm and blues or jump blues.
Cool down, Papa, don't you blow your top. Ain't no use in diving. What's the use of jiving? Straighten up and fly right. Cool down, Papa, don't you blow your top.
18. The Ravens. Long before groups had cool names, there were the Ravens. But why does this groundbreaking R&B group often go unnoticed? The Ravens were among the pioneering post-World War II R&B groups, and also among the earliest R&B groups named for birds. In both their musicality and their nomenclature, they influenced 2 generations of performers that followed, as well as selling lots of records in the process. This New York City vocal quartet featured Jimmy Rick's deep bass and Mithy Marshall's floating tenor, along with baritone Warren Birdland Suttles and tenor Leonard Zeke Puzzi. The Ravens racked up 10 R&B chart hits between 1948 and 1950, including the crossover Write Me a Letter and the influential Old Man River. The influence of the Ravens on the vocal groups of the early 1950s far exceeds the group's moderate chart success. As the first group to feature a bass lead on its recordings, the first established bird group, and the first quartet to add choreography to its stage presentation, the Ravens truly earned the moniker, the greatest group of them all. 17. The Delta Rhythm Boys. These guys weren't just harmonizers, they were innovators. What made the Delta Rhythm Boys stand out for over 5 decades? The Delta Rhythm Boys were an American vocal group active from 1934 to 1987. The group was formed at Langston University in Langston, Oklahoma in 1934 by Carl Jones, Travers Crawford, Otha Lee Gaines, and Kelsey Farr. They moved to Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1936 and worked there under Frederick Hall as the Frederick Hall Quintet and the New Orleans Quintet. They performed on radio programs such as Amos and Andy and The Joan Davis Show, and performed on Broadway in the shows Sing Out the News and Hot Mikado. The group appeared extensively in 15 films. They resettled permanently in Europe in 1956. 16. International Sweethearts of Rhythm. They broke barriers, made history, and played like nobody's business. Meet the band that defied odds and changed jazz forever. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm was the first integrated all-women's band in the United States. The Sweethearts began in the rural junction of Piney Woods, Mississippi in 1937. Lawrence Jones had founded a vocational school there primarily for young black children and teens and wanted to raise money by forming a student swing band. The original members of the Sweethearts were all students who were African American or mixed race during the 1930s. Operating from 1938 to 1946, their boom in popularity came during World War II, when many male jazz artists were serving overseas, leaving an opportunity for women to shine their talents at home. Over time, the group attracted some of the country's strongest female jazz instrumentalists of the era. One of the group's standout performers was trumpeter Ernestine Carroll, better known as Tiny Davis, who was affectionately referred to as the female Louis Armstrong. Armstrong, in fact, was counted among her fans. The Sweethearts also gained an international audience when they spent time entertaining African American troops stationed in Europe for the USO. In 1944, the band was named America's #1 all-girl orchestra by Downbeat magazine.
When you're feeling low and you don't know what to do, just stay in the groove, let nothing bother you.
15. Duke Ellington Orchestra. Timeless music, visionary leader. Duke Ellington's orchestra wasn't just a band, it was a revolution in sound. But what made them unstoppable? The Duke Ellington Orchestra, a trailblazer in the music industry, was founded in the 1920s under the visionary leadership of the incomparable Duke Ellington. Throughout the 1940s, Ellington and his orchestra achieved unprecedented success, crafting a unique sound that seamlessly blended elements of jazz, swing, and big band. The orchestra comprised virtuoso musicians, including legends like Johnny Hodges on saxophone and Cootie Williams on trumpet. Some of their most celebrated compositions, such as Take the A Train and Dusk, became anthems of the era, showcasing Ellington's unparalleled compositional prowess. "14. Arty Shaw's Gramercy 5. A clarinet, a harpsichord, and a jazz band. Sounds unusual, right? Arty Shaw's Gramercy 5 was anything but ordinary. Arty Shaw and his Gramercy 5 was a jazz combo led by band leader, king of the clarinet, swing band leader and composer, Arty Shaw. It's this week's Phantom Dancer feature. The Gramercy Five had different lineups when it ran between 1940 and 1954. After his Australian tour in 1954, Shaw gave up the clarinet and the Gramercy Five, saying he'd done all he could with it. Like other big band leaders of swing like Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey with his Clambake Seven, and Bob Crosby with the Bobcats, Arty Shaw also put together a Gunther Schuller Sextet Cembalo six-member ensemble of members of his orchestra in 1940 after his return from Mexico. He named it after the New York Telephone Center. Stylistic was the music of the first Gramercy Five, an amalgam from the sextets of Benny Goodman and John Kirby, as well as various boogie-woogie recordings. For Arty Shaw, the sextet formation represented the possibility of emerging as a clarinetist more than was possible in his orchestra, Gary Giddens wrote. Although he never allowed himself more than 16 bars, he was the outstanding player. Among the highlights, his lamenting voicings for clarinet, guitar, trumpet, and his exuberant and unexpected klezmer closing. 13. The Three Sons. They brought pop, jazz, and electronic organs together in a way nobody else could. But what really made the Three Sons shine? The Three Sons were an American pop group, most popular during the 1940s and 1950s. The group was formed in 1939 by brothers Al Nevins, guitar, and Morty Nevins, accordion, and their cousin, radio and vaudeville veteran Arty Dunn, vocals, electronic organ. They became a popular nightclub attraction around New York. During an engagement in 1944, they were signed to appear in short musical films for the Soundies movie jukeboxes. They performed 9 songs for the cameras. In 1944, the Three Sons scored their first hit record, Twilight Time. Their version was strictly instrumental and did not feature the lyrics written later by Buck Ram. Twilight Time sold over 4 million copies and was awarded a gold record. In November of 1946, an instrumental version of Rumors Are Flying was #1 in America. Johnny Moore's Three Blazers, Charles Brown. A sound so smooth it laid the groundwork for legends like Ray Charles. But why don't more people remember Johnny Moore's Three Blazers? To the uninitiated, this may seem an odd choice, but between 1946 and 1949, the Los Angeles-based Three Blazers, guitarist Moore, bassist Eddie Williams, and singer-pianist Brown hit the bestseller list 14 times. Influenced by the jazz piano styling and soft tones of Nat King Cole, the classically trained Texas native offered listeners an alternative to the blues shouters and jumping combos of the era: slow, mellow, and precise. A young Ray Charles was one of Brown's devotees. In 1946, they had their greatest success with Driftin' Blues, sung by Brown. Moore refused to sign an exclusive contract with any record company, so the group's early records appeared on various labels, particularly Philo, which later became Aladdin Records, Exclusive Records, and Modern Records. The group followed up the success of Driftin' Blues with several other big R&B hits, including Sunny Road, 1946, New Orleans Blues, 1947, and Merry Christmas Baby, 1947, also a hit in 1948 and 1949. In 1948, frustrated by his lack of recognition and financial reward, Brown left the group for a successful solo career. The remaining two Blazers continued with a succession of vocalists, notably Lee Barnes, Billy Valentine, Floyd Dixon, Mary Jones, Nelson Alexander, and in the mid-1950s, Frankie Irvin. After Nat King Cole broke up his original King Cole trio, Oscar Moore played as a guest with brother Johnny's group. Johnny Moore and the Blazers continued to record for small labels until the early 1960s. 11. Golden Gate Quartet. They could sing gospel like no one else, but they also brought in jazz, blues, and even sound effects. What made the Golden Gate Quartet so versatile? The Golden Gate Quartet, aka the Golden Gate Jubilee Quartet, is an American vocal group. It was formed in 1934 and, with changes in membership, remains active. The group was founded as the Golden Gate Jubilee Singers in 1934 by 4 students at Booker T. Washington High School in Norfolk, Virginia. According to the group's website, the original members were Willie Johnson, baritone, William Langford, tenor, Henry Owens, second tenor, and Orlandis Wilson, bass. Other sources state that Langford and Wilson replaced earlier members Robert Peg Ford and A.C. Eddie Griffin in 1935. From 1935, the group sang in churches and on local radio, gaining a regular spot on radio station WIS in Columbia, South Carolina in 1936. They began as a traditional Jubilee quartet, combining the clever arrangements associated with barbershop quartets with rhythms borrowed from the blues and jazz like scat singing. They developed a broad repertoire of styles, from Owens' mournful, understated approach in songs such as Anyhow or Hush, Somebody's Calling My Name, to the group's highly syncopated arrangements in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Like the Mills Brothers in popular music, they would often include vocal special effects in their songs, imitating train sounds in such songs as Golden Gate Gospel Train. Langford often sang lead using his ability to range from baritone to falsetto, while Johnson narrated in a hip syncopated style that became the hallmark for the group. Wilson's bass served as the anchor for the group, and Owens harmonized with Langford and Johnson. Count Basie Orchestra. Swinging rhythms, stellar solos, and a Kansas City style that changed the game. What made the Count Basie Orchestra one of the greats? The Count Basie Orchestra, a jazz juggernaut, was established in the 1930s and continued to wield significant influence throughout the 1940s. Founded by the sensational Count Basie, the orchestra became a driving force in the swing and big band genres. Renowned for its distinctive Kansas City swing style, the Count Basie Orchestra is characterized by a punchy rhythm section. The ensemble featured luminaries like Lester Young on tenor saxophone and Joe Jones on drums. With hits like 1 O'Clock Jump, the Count Basie Orchestra commanded both critical acclaim and popular success, establishing them as a musical powerhouse. Basie's minimalist yet impactful piano style and the orchestra's impeccable timing contributed to their signature sound. 9. Ivy Benson and her all-girl band. A band led by women, breaking barriers and shattering expectations. How did Ivy Benson and her all-girl band change the music scene? Ivy Benson was an English musician and bandleader who in 1939 led an all-female swing band to prove to the world that women could be good musicians too. Benson and her band rose to fame in the 1940s, headlining variety theaters and topping the bill at the London Palladium, and became the BBC's resident house band. Her band, in one form or another, ran from 1939 to 1982. During those years, she gave hundreds of girls and women the chance to become professional musicians. Fun fact, Benson's band had a high turnover of musicians, as they frequently left to marry GIs they met while touring. She once commented, "I lost 7 in 1 year to America. Only the other week, a girl slipped away from the stage. I thought she was going to the lavatory, but she went off with a GI. Nobody's seen her since." The Orioles. They pioneered the R&B style but are often overshadowed. What's the story behind the Orioles and their role in music history? The Orioles, American vocal group of the late 1940s and early 50s. The members were Sonny Till, by name of Ellington Carl Tilghman, Alexander Sharp, George Nelson, Johnny Reed, and Tommy Gaither. Formed in Baltimore in 1947, the Orioles are often cited as the first vocal group to sing in the rhythm and blues R&B style, which they accomplished by taking the prevailing vocal pop style of the Ink Spots and adding a more rhythmic and rocking approach. Following their success, vocal groups with ornithological names became a staple of rhythm and blues. An appearance on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts television show in 1948 led to a recording contract for the Orioles. Their first recording, It's Too Soon to Know, a slow romantic ballad, launched their career spectacularly by going to #1 on the rhythm and blues chart. Most of the group's records also were quiet ballads that featured Till's heartfelt lead vocal, supported by soft choruses sung by the rest of the group, and almost imperceptible instrumental accompaniment. Their most notable records were Tell Me So, 1949, Crying in the Chapel, 1953, and In the Mission of St. Augustine, 1953. The group disbanded in 1955, by which time they had been all but forgotten as pioneers. Later generations, however, would recognize the group not only as pioneers in rhythm and blues, but also as roots artists of rock and roll, whose influence on the doo-wop vocal groups of the 1950s and 60s was considerable. The Orioles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1995. 7. Benny Goodman and his orchestra. Clarinet in hand, Benny Goodman redefines swing music. But why does his orchestra still matter decades later? Benny Goodman was the first celebrated bandleader of the swing era. Dubbed the King of Swing, his popular emergence marked the beginning of an era. He was an accomplished clarinetist whose distinctive playing gave an identity both to his big band and to the smaller units he led simultaneously. The most popular figure of the first few years of the swing era, he continued to perform until his death 50 years later. Those record successes and an offer to perform at Billy Rose's Music Hall inspired Goodman to organize a permanent performing orchestra, which gave its first performance on June 1st, 1934. His instrumental recording of Moonglow hit #1 in July, and he scored 2 more top 10 hits in the fall with the instrumentals Take My Word and Bugle Call Rag. After a 4.5-month stay at the music hall, he was signed for the Saturday night Let's Dance program on NBC Radio, playing the last hour of the 3-hour show. During the 6 months he spent on the show, he scored another 6 top 10 hits on Columbia, then switched to RCA Victor, for which he recorded 5 more top 10 hits by the end of the year. By 1939, Goodman had lost such major instrumentalists as Gene Krupa and Harry James, who left to found their own bands, and he faced significant competition from newly emerged band leaders such as Arty Shaw and Glenn Miller. But he still managed to score 8 top 10 hits during the year, including the chart topper and The Angels Sing, vocal by Martha Tilton, another inductee to the Grammy Hall of Fame. Goodman disbanded in March 1944. Six, Les Brown and his band of renown. From college band to national fame, how did Les Brown's orchestra stand the test of time and become legends? Brown attended college at Duke University from 1932 to 1936. There, he led the group Les Brown and his Blue Devils, who performed regularly on Duke's campus and up and down the East Coast. Brown took the band on an extensive summer tour in 1936. At the end of the tour, while some of the band members returned to Duke to continue their education, others stayed on with Brown and continued to tour, becoming in 1938 the Band of Renown. The band's original drummer, Don Kramer, became the acting manager and helped define their future. In 1941, Brown's band had a #1 hit, Joltin' Joe DiMaggio, with his lead vocalist, Betty Bonney. In 1942, Brown and his band concluded work on an RKO picture, Sweet and Hot, played at the Palladium Ballroom, Hollywood. A few years later, in 1945, this band brought Doris Day into prominence with their recording of Sentimental Journey. The song's release coincided with the end of World War II in Europe and became an unofficial homecoming theme for many veterans. The band had 9 other #1 hit songs, including I've Got My Love to Keep Me Warm. Les Brown and the Band of Renown performed with Bob Hope on radio, stage, and television for almost 50 years.
Got the string around my finger. What a world, what a life.
5. The Mills Brothers. They made their voices sound like instruments and their harmonies were out of this world. But how did the Mills Brothers influence music history? The Mills Brothers, John Charles, Herbert, Harry, and Donald, were an American vocal quartet that was among the most unique and influential in the history of both jazz and mainstream popular music. They gave their first public performances in variety shows on the radio in Cincinnati, Ohio. In about 1930, they moved to New York City, where they became the first African American singers to have their own national radio show. Billed as 4 boys and a guitar, and accompanied only by Brother John's guitar, they could sound like a full jazz band, particularly on such numbers as Tiger Rag, St. Louis Blues, and Bugle Call Rag. Each brother specialized in an instrument. They imitated 2 trumpets, a trombone, and a tuba. They were also a hit on records and in live performances, and they appeared in several films, including The Big Broadcast, 1932, and Broadway Gondolier, 1935. John C. Mills' sudden death in 1936 was a blow to the close-knit siblings, and they almost dissolved the act. Fortunately, their father took over his son's role, and the group continued without any loss in popularity, although it was necessary to employ an outside guitarist. They continued mostly in the hot jazz style with a strong emphasis on scat singing and instrumental imitations, and made records with such artists as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and the Boswell sisters. The Mills Brothers had their biggest hit in 1943 with Paper Doll, which sold more than 6 million records and was also a bestseller as sheet music. Their later hits included You Always Hurt the One You Love, 1944, Glowworm, 1952, and Opus 1, 1952. John H. Mills retired in 1956, and the brothers continued as a trio, recording and performing regularly into the 1970s. The act came to an end after Harry's death in 1982. But Donald Mills, in his last years, performed the group's hits with his son John H. Mills II. Their sound became identified with an era, and many of the recordings were later used on the soundtracks of movies, including Raging Bull, 1980, Pearl Harbor, 2001, and Being Julia, 2004. 4. Lawrence Welk and his orchestra. Bubbly, lighthearted, and unforgettable. But how did Lawrence Welk's orchestra capture the hearts of a generation with champagne music? The music performed by Lawrence Welk, 1903 to 1992, and his champagne music makers alternately has been admired and reviled for the bandleader's insistence on inoffensive subject matter, emphasizing American patriotism and traditional Christian values, and arrangements emphasizing melody over improvisation and technical skill. In 1938, the orchestra garnered major performance exposure for a concert at the St. Paul Hotel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where, according to a legend perpetuated by Welk, the group's music earned the descriptive champagne music from a listener who pronounced that the orchestra's music was effervescent, like champagne. From that time forward, the band was billed as the champagne music of Lawrence Welk. During the 1940s, Welk and his band performed as the house orchestra at the Trianon Ballroom in Chicago, Illinois. After a successful decade in Chicago, Welk moved what he called his musical family to Southern California, where a 1951 late-night appearance on television station KTLA became the springboard for his later national fame. 3. The Ink Spots. They broke barriers and brought smooth vocal harmonies to the masses. But what's the legacy of the Ink Spots? The Ink Spots, an American vocal group, were prominent in the late 1930s and 40s. One of the first African-American groups, along with the Mills Brothers, to reach both black and white audiences, the Ink Spots exerted great influence on the development of the doo-wop vocal style. The principal members were Orville Hoppy Jones, Charles Fuqua, Ivory Deke Watson, Bill Kenny, Jerry Daniels, Herb Kenny, and Billy Bowen. Formed in 1932 as the King, Jack, and the Jesters, the group became the Ink Spots when they relocated to New York City. After Herb Kenny replaced original member Daniels, the group began a slow evolution toward its distinctive sound. In 1939, the Ink Spots scored a huge hit with If I Didn't Care, on which Bill Kenny's tenor lead contrasted with Jones's deep bass. In establishing the prominence of the high tenor lead and adding spoken bass choruses to the backing harmonies, the Ink Spots laid the groundwork for countless doo-wop and rhythm and blues vocal groups, from the Ravens and the Orioles to Motown's Temptations. Among their many hits in the 1940s were Address Unknown, My Prayer, later re-recorded by the Platters, Into Each Life Some Rain Must Fall, a collaboration with Ella Fitzgerald, We Three, To Each His Own, and The Gypsy. In the early 1950s, the group split into two, and multiple incarnations of the Ink Spots continued to perform through the 1990s. The Ink Spots were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989.
Frantic, 'cause we've lost the spark. Is there panic when it starts turning dark?
2. The Dorsey Brothers. Sibling rivalry led to one of the most legendary band splits in history. But how did the Dorsey Brothers change swing forever? Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey first teamed up together on records as the Dorsey Brothers in 1928, but the groups they led through 1933 were strictly studio affairs, featuring classic jazz and hot dance music, along with some ballads. In 1934, they decided to put together a regular orchestra, And by 1935, with Bob Crosby and later Bob Eberly taking the vocals and Glenn Miller providing many of the arrangements, the group was on the brink of success in the early swing era. However, a well-publicized argument at a ballroom over the tempo of I'll Never Say Never Again Again led to Tommy Dorsey immediately leaving and starting his own separate orchestra. By 1953, both brothers had had major success with their bands and had long since patched up their differences. Because their orchestras were struggling, it was decided that Jimmy would break up his band and co-lead Tommy's. For nearly 4 years, the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra featured first-class dance music with occasional solos from trumpeter Charlie Shavers and the two brothers. They also had their own television show. With Tommy's sudden death in November 1956, Jimmy followed 7 months later, the partnership came to an end. One, Bob Crosby with the Bobcats. Smaller in size but huge in sound, what made Bob Crosby and his Bobcats the most beloved swing group of their time? Bob Crosby's Bobcats, a smaller hop band within the Bob Crosby Orchestra. Founding member, bassist, and arranger Bob Haggart joins us with piano legend Dick Hyman. Many of the Bobcats were native New Orleanians. Guitarist Nappy Lamar, saxophonist Eddie Miller, clarinetist Irving Fazzola, and drummer Ray Bauduc all hailed from the Crescent City. With this core of New Orleans players, there was a strong emphasis on improvisation, coupled with the driving rhythmic feel that proved popular among bobby soxers and jitterbuggers of the late 1930s. At the height of their fame in 1939, the Bobcats had their own half-hour weekly show on national radio called the Dixieland Music Shop, a segment of the Camel Caravan radio program. Their regularly featured guests were singer and songwriter Johnny Mercer and vocalist Helen Ward. The Bobcats and the larger Bob Crosby Orchestra operated as a team. Musical ideas came from everyone within the band, as opposed to the swing band standard, based on one strong-willed, charismatic leader who called the shots. Thanks for tuning in and reliving these lost legends of the 1940s with us. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Check out our other videos to explore more hidden gems and music history.